Hey YouTube, Jim here. Welcome to Top 10 Archive. When a person is sentenced for an incredible amount of time, chances are they aren't intended to ever make it out of prison. But not everyone is willing to just roll over and die in a cell. For this Top 10 Archive, we're going behind bars and exploring the top 10 people that outlived crazy prison sentences. Now before we get started, be sure to subscribe and click the bell to be notified of future videos. Like what you watch? Then go ahead and hit that thumbs up and leave us a comment.
Number 10. Eddie Collins, 43 years. Drug deals often go wrong, and in the case of Eddie Collins, his went terribly, terribly wrong. While engaged in an exchange of contraband in the 70s, an altercation broke out, and Collins's 17-year-old brother, Johnny, pulled out a gun and shot their dealer. Johnny pled guilty and wound up serving only 10 years. Collins, on the other hand, was convicted under Arizona's criminal code from 1956 and was sentenced without eligibility for parole. Collins spent 44 years behind bars and, despite support from the Arizona Justice Project, was not released until his incredible sentence was over. Number 9. Otis Johnson, 44 years. For 44 years, Otis Johnson lived behind bars for his attempt at murdering a police officer. Then 25 years old, at the time of his release in August 2014, Johnson was 69, having lived the prime of his life in a correctional facility. Otis had no matter of luck while serving either, as his original release date was extended an additional 8 months due to a juvenile shoplifting charge he received when he was 17 years old. The entire time he was behind bars, Otis denied the allegations against him. Johnson could have gotten out earlier on parole, but was denied 7 times, all because he wouldn't confess to the crime. Number 8. Joe Carr, 56 years. Known for surviving the longest prison sentence in the state of Kansas, Joe Carr was convicted for the strangling of a newborn baby. He then disposed of the body in the Arkansas River, but left behind enough evidence to be convicted of the crime. On September 12, 1941, Carr told his wife he was going to find a home for their newborn infant as they had no means to care for it. Rather than give it a home, however, Carr killed it. When he was picked up for the infant's disappearance, he pled guilty. He served all but 7 weeks of his 56-year prison sentence and was released on August 13, 1997, at the age of 77. Number 7. Howard Kristensen, 58 years. In 1937, 16-year-old Howard Christensen was convicted for the murder of Ada Carey. His accomplice, a 17-year-old student, was also convicted, but hung himself 6 years into his sentence. Christensen was sentenced to 58 years, though he refused to go the route of his accomplice and ultimately lived out his sentence despite declining health. At the age of 79, 3 years after his release from the South Dakota State Penitentiary, he passed away from liver and stomach cancer. Number 6. Harvey Stewart, 63 years. In July of 1958, the murder of 26-year-old James Laird and an armed robbery landed Harvey Stewart in prison. Though Stewart claims the murder was in self-defense and his trial was rigged to land him in prison, he served the entirety of his 63 years before being released on parole in 2011. By the time he was released, he was 85 years old and had served the longest sentence in the state of Texas. Number 5. Charles Edret Ford, 64 years. Ford's story has an ending that's both good but also incredibly bad. In 1952, Ford, a black male, was convicted by an all-white jury at the age of 20 for murder. In 1975, while he was on parole, he was found guilty again for an assault, despite the victim's insistence that Ford was not the attacker. Ford was eventually granted a retrial in 2015 because he had not been informed of his appeal rights and was ultimately found innocent and released into a nursing home at the age of 84. Number 4. Richard Honeck, 64 years, 44 days. Richard Honeck was first sentenced for the murder of Walter F. Kohler, a former school friend, in November of 1899. At 20 years old, he was sentenced to 64 years for the brutal murder, which he pulled off with an arsenal of 2 Bowie knives, a case knife, and 3 different calibers of revolvers. Honeck was accompanied by a second man, Herman Hunhausen, and aimed to murder Kohler in response to his testimony against the pair years earlier for setting a series of fires in Hermann, Missouri. In 1963, Honeck would be released at the age of 92, then lived his last 5 years as a free man after serving 64 years and 44 days in prison. Number 3. Clarence Marshall, 64 years, 70 days. Michigan's longest-serving prisoner, Clarence Marshall, spent 64 years and 70 days behind bars after being convicted of an armed robbery and an unarmed assault with the intent to rob and steal. His date of sentence was November 18, 1952, and a public hearing to consider his parole was held on October 10, 2012. He was ultimately granted parole 3 years later on January 27, 2015, at the age of 84. Number 2. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby, 66 years, 123 days. Sentenced to life in prison for the second-degree murder of James Brown in 1908, Grigsby wasn't released from the Indiana State Penitentiary until 1974. He was freed at the age of 89 and had served 66 years and 123 days behind bars. The incident between Grigsby and Brown unfolded in a saloon in Anderson, Illinois on December 3, 1907. After his sentencing, it took Grigsby days in a horse and cart to reach the penitentiary. Number 1. Paul Geidel, Jr., 68 years, 245 days. At the age of 86, Geidel Jr. was paroled from his conviction for the murder of 73-year-old William H. Jackson in 1911. Geidel was only 17 years old and working as a bellhop at the time of the murder. Jackson was found to have been suffocated to death. 2 days after the crime, Geidel was arrested and initially sentenced to 20 years in prison. Unfortunately, his time in custody was extended after doctors determined him to be legally insane in 1926. He was moved to Dannemora State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he remained in custody until 1972. It wasn't until August 1974 that Geidel was granted parole, but after spending 63 years imprisoned, he opted to remain in prison for another 6 years, fearing he wouldn't survive on the outside because he didn't have any friends or family. Geidel eventually became a free man on May 7, 1980, and died at the age of 93. Thanks for watching. Did these stories amaze you? Let us know your reactions in the comments below. Subscribe, click the bell, and be sure to like this video. And do try to stay out of trouble. We don't ever want to be writing stories like these about you.